When Princess Isabella of Valdoria opened that dusty envelope hidden behind her late mother-in-law's portrait, she never imagined the contents would shatter everything she believed about the royal bloodline. The DNA results trembled in her hands as tears streamed down her face, realizing that 30 years of lies were about to unravel the most powerful monarchy in Europe. What Queen Eleanor had hidden in her final days wasn't just a family secret. It was a revelation that could topple kingdoms and rewrite history itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as Princess Isabella Montenegro walked through the corridors she had called home for 15 years. Her footsteps echoed in the vast hallways, each step carrying the weight of recent loss and mounting responsibilities. 3 weeks had passed since Queen Eleanor's funeral, and the palace still felt hollow without the matriarch's commanding presence. Isabella paused before the grand staircase, her fingers trailing along the ornate banister that had been polished by countless hands over 3 centuries. At 38, she had grown accustomed to the palace's grandeur, but today everything felt different. The portraits of long-dead kings and queens seemed to watch her with knowing eyes, as if they harbored secrets she was only beginning to uncover. Her marriage to Crown Prince Alexander had been arranged when she was 23, a union designed to strengthen ties between Valdoria and her homeland of Montenegro. What had begun as a political alliance had blossomed into genuine love, and Isabella had embraced her role as future queen with grace and determination. She had learned the language, studied the history, and won over the people with her charitable work and warm personality. But now, with Queen Eleanor gone, Isabella found herself thrust into a position she hadn't expected to occupy so soon. Alexander was away on a diplomatic mission in Asia, leaving her to handle the delicate transition period. The coronation was still months away, but the weight of the crown already pressed heavily on her shoulders. The royal staff moved quietly through the palace, their hushed whispers and careful glances telling Isabella that gossip was already spreading. The tabloids were having a field day with speculation about the new reign, and political analysts were questioning whether Isabella, as a foreign-born princess, would be accepted as queen. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and she felt more isolated than ever. As she made her way to Queen Eleanor's former study, Isabella reflected on her relationship with her mother-in-law. Eleanor had been a formidable woman, ruling Valdoria for 45 years with an iron will wrapped in velvet gloves. She had been kind to Isabella, but always maintained a certain distance, as if she were constantly evaluating her daughter-in-law's worthiness. There had been moments of warmth, particularly after Isabella had given birth to Prince Marcus and Princess Sophia, but Eleanor had always seemed to be holding something back. The study door was heavy oak, adorned with the royal coat of arms. Isabella had only been inside a handful of times during Eleanor's lifetime, usually for formal meetings or brief consultations. Now, as the future queen, she needed to familiarize herself with the documents and correspondence that would soon become her responsibility. The room smelled of leather and old paper, with hints of the lavender perfume Eleanor had favored. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes on history, politics, and royal protocol. Eleanor's desk dominated the center of the room, its surface still bearing the impression of her final days, half-finished letters, official stamps, and a crystal paperweight that caught the afternoon light. Isabella settled into the high-backed chair behind the desk, feeling like an intruder in sacred space. She began sorting through the papers, most of which dealt with routine royal business, charity patronages, ceremonial duties, and correspondence with other European monarchies. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, the kind of documentation one would expect from a long-serving queen. It was when she reached for a stack of personal letters that her hand accidentally brushed against something unexpected. Behind Eleanor's official portrait, which hung directly behind the desk, her fingers detected a slight gap in the wall. Curious, Isabella stood and examined the area more closely. What she discovered was a small hidden panel, barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look. Her heart began to race as she worked the panel open. Inside was a small cavity containing a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with red wax bearing Eleanor's personal seal. The envelope was unmarked except for a date from 20 years ago and a single word written in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting: truth. Isabella's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside were several documents, but the one on top made her blood run cold. It was a DNA test report, dated just months before Eleanor's death. The names on the report made her head spin: Alexander Montenegro Valdoria and Eleanor Margaret Valdoria. But what shattered her world was the conclusion printed in stark black letters. Probability of paternal relationship, 0%. The documents slipped from her fingers, scattering across the Persian carpet like autumn leaves. Isabella sank back into the chair, her mind reeling with the implications. If Alexander was not biologically related to the late King Frederick, then his claim to the throne was illegitimate. More than that, it meant her own children, Marcus and Sophia, were not true heirs to the Valdorian crown. She picked up the scattered papers with shaking hands, examining each one carefully. There were birth certificates, medical records, and correspondence with private investigators. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of a secret that Eleanor had carried for decades. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. 20 years ago, facing rumors about Alexander's parentage that had begun circulating in certain political circles, Eleanor had secretly commissioned DNA tests. The results had confirmed her worst fears. The crown prince was not the biological son of King Frederick. But, rather than reveal the truth and throw the kingdom into chaos, Eleanor had buried the evidence and continued the royal charade. Isabella found a handwritten letter from Eleanor, addressed to no one in particular, but clearly meant as a confession for posterity. In it, the late queen detailed a brief affair she had during a difficult period in her marriage to Frederick. She had been young and lonely, feeling trapped by the restrictions of royal life. The affair had lasted only a few months, but it had resulted in Alexander's conception. The letter revealed Eleanor's anguish over the years, watching Alexander grow into a man worthy of the crown while knowing he had no legal right to it. She had considered revealing the truth many times, but had always pulled back, unable to destroy her son's life and the stability of the kingdom. The DNA test had been her final attempt to find some way to resolve the situation, but her death had intervened before she could act. Isabella sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of the situation became clear. She held in her hands the power to destroy the monarchy or to continue the lie that had sustained it for decades. Alexander was a good man and would make an excellent king, but his rule would be built on a foundation of deception. Her own children's futures hung in the balance, their royal titles suddenly meaningless if the truth came to light. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made Isabella quickly gather the documents and return them to their hiding place. She smoothed her dress and attempted to compose herself, but her hands were still shaking when her personal secretary, Maria, knocked on the door. "Your Highness," Maria said as she entered, "the Prime Minister has requested a meeting about the upcoming state dinner. Shall I schedule it for this afternoon?" Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "Yes, that would be fine. And, Maria, I'll be working late in the study tonight. Please see that I'm not disturbed unless it's urgent." As Maria left, Isabella realized that her life had just taken an irreversible turn. The weight of Eleanor's secret was now hers to bear, and every decision she made going forward would be colored by this terrible knowledge. She thought of Alexander, thousands of miles away, blissfully unaware that his entire identity was built on a lie. She thought of Marcus and Sophia playing in their nursery, innocent of the fact that their royal birthright might be nothing more than an elaborate fiction. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the study. Isabella remained at the desk, staring at Eleanor's portrait and wondering how many other secrets were hidden within the palace walls. The woman in the painting seemed to be watching her, those painted eyes holding depths of knowledge and sorrow that Isabella was only beginning to understand. As evening approached, Isabella knew she faced an impossible choice. She could reveal the truth and watch the monarchy crumble, destroying not only Alexander's life, but potentially destabilizing the entire kingdom. Or she could become complicit in the deception, carrying Eleanor's secret to her own grave and passing the burden to future generations. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, and she hadn't even been coronated yet. In the space of a single afternoon, Isabella had gone from grieving daughter-in-law to the keeper of a royal secret that could change the course of history. The question that would haunt her through the sleepless night ahead was simple yet devastating. What was more important, the truth or the crown? Outside, the palace guards continued their eternal vigil, unaware that the very foundation of what they protected had just shifted beneath their feet. The kingdom of Valdoria slept peacefully, its citizens secure in their belief in the royal bloodline that had ruled them for centuries. But, in the Queen's study, surrounded by the weight of history and the burden of truth, Princess Isabella Montenegro faced the most difficult decision of her life. The documents hidden behind Eleanor's portrait contained more than just DNA results and confessions. They held the power to reshape a nation, and that power now rested in Isabella's trembling hands. As she finally rose from the desk and prepared to face whatever came next, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The royal secret that had died with Queen Eleanor had been reborn, and Princess Isabella would have to decide whether to let it live or finally put it to rest. The crown awaited, but so did the truth, and sometimes the two could not coexist in the same kingdom. Sleep eluded Princess Isabella that night as she lay in the ornate four-poster bed she shared with Alexander. The empty space beside her felt vast and cold, a physical reminder of the emotional distance that now separated her from her husband, even though he remained unaware of the chasm that had opened between them. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the DNA results, the stark numbers that had the power to unravel 3 decades of carefully constructed royal identity. By dawn, Isabella had made a decision that surprised even herself. She would not bear this burden alone. There was one person in the palace who had served the royal family longer than anyone, who had witnessed the intimate moments and quiet dramas that shaped the monarchy behind closed doors. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore had been Eleanor's personal secretary for over 30 years, and if anyone could provide context for the explosive documents Isabella had discovered, it would be her. Catherine Whitmore was a woman of 62 who carried herself with the quiet dignity that came from decades of keeping royal secrets. Her silver hair was always perfectly coiffed, her navy suits impeccably tailored, and her demeanor unflappably professional. She had been Eleanor's confidant, gatekeeper, and sometimes her only true friend in a world where genuine relationships were rare commodities. Isabella found Catherine in her small office adjacent to the Queen's former study, methodically organizing Eleanor's personal papers for the royal archives. The older woman looked up as Isabella entered, immediately sensing the tension in the princess's bearing. "Your Highness," Catherine said, rising from her desk with a slight curtsy. "I wasn't expecting you so early. Is there something you need?" Isabella closed the door behind her and took a seat across from Catherine's desk. The morning light streaming through the narrow window seemed harsh and unforgiving, highlighting every line of worry on Isabella's face. "Catherine, I need to ask you about something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," Isabella began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did Queen Eleanor ever speak to you about doubts regarding Prince Alexander's parentage?" The change in Catherine's demeanor was immediate and telling. Her composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of fear and recognition before she quickly regained her composure. But it was enough for Isabella to know that her suspicions were correct. "Your Highness, I'm not sure what you're referring to," Catherine replied carefully, but her hands betrayed her nervousness as they fidgeted with the papers on her desk. Isabella reached into her handbag and withdrew one of the DNA test reports, placing it on the desk between them. Catherine's face went pale as she recognized the document, her eyes widening with shock and something that might have been relief. "She told you, didn't she?" Isabella asked gently. "You knew about this?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the damning document. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I helped her arrange the test," she admitted. "It was eating her alive, the not knowing for certain. The rumors had been circulating for years, whispered in political circles and gossip columns. She needed to know the truth, even if she never intended to act on it." The revelation hit Isabella like a physical blow. "You've known all along that Alexander isn't Frederick's biological son?" "I've suspected since he was born," Catherine confessed, her professional composure finally cracking. The timing was questionable. The Queen had gone through a very difficult period in her marriage. King Frederick was dealing with a major political crisis, and there were rumors about his own infidelities. Eleanor felt abandoned and lonely. She made a mistake, one that haunted her for the rest of her life. Isabella leaned forward, desperate for more information. Who was it? Who was Alexander's father? Catherine hesitated, then opened a locked drawer in her desk. From it, she withdrew a small photograph of a handsome man in his 30s, dressed in the uniform of the Royal Guard. "Captain James Morrison," she said quietly. "He was the Queen's personal security detail during that difficult summer 40 years ago. He was married, had children of his own. When Eleanor realized she was pregnant, she ended the affair immediately. What happened to him? He was transferred to a diplomatic post in Canada shortly after Alexander's birth. He died in a car accident 10 years later, never knowing he had a son who would one day inherit a throne. Catherine's voice was barely audible now. Eleanor made sure his family was well cared for financially, through anonymous trusts and scholarships. It was her way of making amends. Isabella stared at the photograph, trying to see any resemblance to her husband. There were similarities: the strong jawline, the deep-set eyes, features she had always attributed to Alexander's unique charm rather than questioning their origin. Did King Frederick ever suspect? Isabella asked. Catherine shook her head. If he did, he never said anything. He loved Alexander as his own son from the moment he was born. Frederick was a good man, and he wanted to believe in his family. Eleanor never gave him reason to doubt. The full scope of the deception was beginning to dawn on Isabella. It wasn't just a single lie, but an entire web of carefully constructed truths and omissions that had sustained the monarchy for decades. Eleanor had lived with this secret every day, watching her son prepare for a throne he had no legal right to inherit, loving him too much to destroy his life with the truth. Why didn't she ever tell Alexander? Isabella asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Because she loved him more than the crown, Catherine replied simply. Eleanor believed that Alexander was meant to be king, regardless of his biological parentage. She had watched him grow into a man of integrity and wisdom, someone who truly cared about the people of Valdoria. She couldn't bear the thought of destroying that future based on what she saw as a biological technicality. Isabella understood the sentiment, but the implications were staggering. Catherine, if this comes to light, it won't matter how worthy Alexander is. The constitutional crisis alone could bring down the monarchy. And my children. She couldn't finish the sentence. Your children are innocent in all of this, Catherine said firmly. Prince Marcus and Princess Sophia carry royal blood through your husband's lineage, regardless of his biological father. They are legitimate heirs in every way that matters. But not in the eyes of the law, Isabella countered. If Alexander's claim is illegitimate, then their inheritance is equally invalid. The two women sat in heavy silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a physical force. Finally, Catherine spoke again. There's something else you should know, she said reluctantly. The Queen wasn't the only one who knew. There are others who have suspected or discovered the truth over the years. Isabella's heart sank. Who? Lord Pemberton, the former Prime Minister, had his suspicions. He never had proof, but he made several veiled references to the matter during private meetings with the Queen. And there's Dr. Harrison, the royal physician who delivered Alexander. He's retired now, but he was present during some very private conversations between the Queen and myself. The circle of knowledge was wider than Isabella had feared. If these men knew or suspected the truth, how many others might have pieced together the puzzle over the years? How long could such a significant secret remain buried in an age of investigative journalism and social media? What did Queen Eleanor plan to do with the DNA results? Isabella asked. Catherine reached into her drawer again and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing Isabella's name in Eleanor's handwriting. She left this for you, Catherine said, her voice heavy with sorrow. I was instructed to give it to you only if you discovered the truth on your own. With trembling fingers, Isabella opened the envelope and unfolded the letter within. Eleanor's elegant handwriting covered 3 pages, and, as Isabella read, she felt the late Queen's anguish and love pouring through every word. My dearest Isabella, if you are reading this letter, then you have found the documents I could never bring myself to destroy. I pray that you will understand the impossible position I have been in for so many years, and that you will not judge me too harshly for the choices I made. When I discovered I was carrying another man's child, I considered ending the pregnancy. The scandal would have destroyed the monarchy and ruined countless lives. But I could not bring myself to do it. Alexander was innocent of my sins, and he deserved the chance to live and be loved. I have watched my son grow into a man worthy of any throne, and I believe with all my heart that he was meant to be king of Valdoria. Blood does not make a ruler, character does. Alexander has shown time and again that he possesses the wisdom, compassion, and strength necessary to lead our people into the future. I leave this burden to you because I believe you love him as much as I do, and because you are strong enough to make the choice I could never make. You can reveal the truth and let the constitutional scholars and politicians decide our fate, or you can protect the man you married and the future of our kingdom. Whatever you decide, know that my love for you as a daughter has been one of the greatest joys of my later years. You have brought happiness to Alexander's life and purpose to his reign. Your children are a blessing to our family, and they will be wonderful representatives of the crown, whatever that crown may represent in the years to come. I am sorry to leave you with this terrible knowledge, but I trust your judgment more than my own. You see clearly where my love made me blind. With all my love and respect, Eleanor Isabella folded the letter carefully, her eyes blurred with tears. Eleanor had not only hidden the truth, she had made Isabella complicit in whatever decision came next. The late queen had passed on not just a secret, but the responsibility for determining the future of the monarchy itself. She really believed in Alexander, Isabella said softly. Catherine nodded. More than anything, she used to say that God works in mysterious ways, and perhaps Alexander's true parentage was meant to bring new blood and fresh perspectives to an ancient institution. She believed he was exactly the King Valdoria needed, regardless of his DNA. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside made both women freeze. Catherine quickly gathered the documents and photographs, returning them to their hiding places as Isabella composed herself. A moment later, there was a soft knock on the door. "Come in," Catherine called, her voice professionally steady once again. It was Maria, Isabella's secretary, looking somewhat flustered. "Your Highness, forgive the interruption, but Prince Alexander has called from Singapore. He's concerned because he couldn't reach you on your private line last night. He's holding on line 1 in your office." Isabella's heart raced. The thought of speaking to Alexander now, armed with the knowledge of his true parentage, felt overwhelming. How could she maintain the pretense of normalcy when everything had changed? "Tell him I'll be there in just a moment," Isabella replied, proud that her voice remained steady. As Maria left, Catherine reached across the desk and gently touched Isabella's hand. "Your Highness, whatever you decide, know that you have my complete loyalty and support. This secret has been my burden for 3 decades, and I understand the weight of it. But also remember that Alexander is still the same man you married, the same father to your children, and the same future king who will serve Valdoria with honor." Isabella squeezed Catherine's hand gratefully. "Thank you for your honesty. And Catherine, this conversation never happened." "Of course, Your Highness." As Isabella made her way to her office to take Alexander's call, her mind was racing with questions and possibilities. She had thought discovering the truth would provide clarity, but instead it had opened up new layers of complexity and moral ambiguity. Eleanor's letter had made it clear that the choice was now entirely Isabella's to make. The phone was waiting on her desk, its red light blinking urgently. Isabella took a deep breath and picked up the receiver, preparing to speak to the man she loved while carrying the weight of his secret identity. "Alexander," she said, hoping her voice sounded normal. "Isabella, darling, thank God." Alexander's familiar voice came through clearly despite the distance. "I tried calling you last night, but couldn't get through. Is everything all right? You sound different." Even across thousands of miles, her husband could detect the subtle changes in her voice. It was a testament to how well they knew each other, which made the deception she was contemplating even more painful. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired. I've been sorting through your mother's papers, and it's emotionally exhausting. I can imagine. I wish I could be there with you. This diplomatic tour feels endless, and I hate leaving you to handle everything alone." The irony was crushing. Alexander was expressing regret about being absent during what he thought was a routine transition period, having no idea that his wife had just learned he was not who he believed himself to be. "When will you be home?" Isabella asked, needing to know how much time she had to decide what to do with the information she possessed. 2 more weeks, barring any complications. The trade negotiations are going well, but these things take time. "How are Marcus and Sophia?" "They're fine. They miss their father." The words came out more emotionally charged than Isabella had intended. "Isabella, are you sure you're all right? You really do sound upset about something." For a moment, Isabella was tempted to tell him everything right then and there. The urge to unburden herself of Eleanor's secret was almost overwhelming. But she realized that such a revelation deserved more than a long-distance phone call. If she was going to destroy Alexander's world, she owed him the courtesy of doing it face to face. "I miss you," she said instead, which was true enough. 2 weeks feels like forever. They spoke for a few more minutes about mundane matters, the children's activities, upcoming royal engagements, the weather in Singapore versus Valdoria. Throughout the conversation, Isabella found herself studying Alexander's voice for any hint of his true identity, listening for traces of Captain James Morrison in her husband's accent and mannerisms. It was a futile exercise that only made her feel more distant from the man she loved. After hanging up, Isabella remained at her desk, staring at the phone as if it could provide answers to the impossible questions she faced. In 2 weeks, Alexander would return home expecting to continue his preparation for kingship, unaware that his wife held evidence that could strip him of everything he had ever believed about himself. The weight of Eleanor's secret had become her own, and with it came the power to either preserve the monarchy or tear it down. As she sat in the quiet of her office, surrounded by the portraits and symbols of 1,000 years of royal history, Isabella realized that she was no longer just a princess preparing to become queen. She had become the guardian of a truth that could reshape the kingdom itself. The next 2 weeks would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone she loved. And the clock had already started ticking. The days following Isabella's discovery passed in a blur of royal duties and sleepless nights. She found herself going through the motions of her responsibilities while her mind remained consumed by the secret she now carried. Every public appearance felt like a performance, every smile forced, every word carefully measured to avoid revealing the turmoil beneath the surface. It was during a charity gala for the Royal Children's Foundation that Isabella first noticed she was being watched. The event was held at the grand ballroom of the palace, with hundreds of Valdoria's most prominent citizens in attendance. Isabella moved through the crowd with practiced grace, making conversation and expressing gratitude for donations, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was studying her more intently than usual. The sensation led her to scan the room until her eyes met those of a man she didn't immediately recognize. He was perhaps 50 years old, well-dressed in an expensive suit, with sharp features and calculating eyes. When their gazes met, he didn't look away as most people would. Instead, he raised his champagne glass in a subtle salute before disappearing into the crowd. The encounter left Isabella unsettled, but she pushed the feeling aside and continued with her duties. It wasn't until later that evening, when she was reviewing the guest list with her security detail, that she learned the man's identity. Victor Ashworth, an investigative journalist known for his exposés of political scandals and cover-ups. What was Mr. Ashworth's reason for attending tonight? Isabella asked her security chief, Colonel Davies. He's on the media list, Your Highness. He covers royal events for the National Tribune. He's been accredited for palace events for several years now, Davies replied, though his tone suggested he shared Isabella's unease about the man. Isabella made a mental note to have Ashworth investigated discreetly. If he was sniffing around for a story, she needed to know how much he might already suspect about the royal family's secrets. The next morning brought more troubling news. Catherine Whitmore appeared in Isabella's office looking more shaken than Isabella had ever seen her. The usually composed secretary was pale and trembling as she placed a manila envelope on Isabella's desk. This was delivered to my home address last night, Catherine said quietly. It was left in my mailbox with no postmark, no return address. Isabella opened the envelope with growing dread. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy but recognizable image of herself and Catherine in deep conversation in the secretary's office 3 days earlier. Attached was a brief typed note. Some secrets are harder to keep than others. We should meet soon. A friend, the implications were chilling. Someone had been watching them, had somehow managed to photograph their private conversation about Alexander's parentage. The carefully controlled environment of the palace, with its security measures and trusted staff, had been compromised. Catherine, who else has access to your office? Isabella asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The cleaning staff, maintenance workers, and anyone with palace security clearance. But, Your Highness, that photograph was taken from an angle that suggests. Catherine paused, reluctant to voice her suspicions. That suggests what? That someone was positioned in the corridor, possibly using specialized equipment. This wasn't a casual observation, it was deliberate surveillance. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. If someone was actively investigating the royal family with such sophisticated methods, the DNA test results and Eleanor's confession might not be the only secrets at risk of exposure. We need to assume that our conversation was recorded as well, Isabella said grimly. Which means someone now knows exactly what we discussed. The next few days were tense as Isabella waited for contact from whoever had sent the photograph. She continued her public duties while privately working with Colonel Davies to review palace security and identify potential sources of the leak. The investigation revealed nothing concrete, but it did uncover a disturbing pattern of small security lapses and unexplained access to restricted areas over the past several months. The contact came exactly 1 week after the photograph was delivered. Isabella received a phone call on her private line from a voice she didn't recognize. "Your Highness, I believe you received my message. We need to talk." "Who is this?" Isabella demanded, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. Someone who has information that could be very damaging to your family if it became public knowledge. But also someone who might be willing to help you manage that information under the right circumstances. Isabella's blood ran cold. "What do you want?" "Just a conversation. Tomorrow evening, the Rose Garden Pavilion at 7 o'clock. Come alone, and bring the documents you found in Queen Eleanor's study." The line went dead before Isabella could respond. She sat staring at the phone, realizing that her worst fears were being realized. The secret that had died with Eleanor was now in the hands of someone who clearly intended to use it for their own purposes. That evening, Isabella called an emergency meeting with Catherine Whitmore and Colonel Davies in her private study. She needed allies she could trust completely, and these two individuals had already proven their loyalty beyond question. "The situation has escalated," Isabella began without preamble. "Someone knows about Alexander's parentage, and they're demanding a meeting." Colonel Davies, a man in his 50s who had served the royal family for over 20 years, listened grimly as Isabella recounted the phone call. His military bearing and sharp intelligence had made him invaluable to the royal security apparatus, and Isabella knew she could rely on his discretion. "Your Highness, I strongly advise against meeting with this person alone," Davies said immediately. "This has all the hallmarks of a blackmail operation, and your safety could be at risk." "But if I refuse to meet, they might simply make the information public," Isabella countered. "At least if I talk to them, I might be able to negotiate or buy time." Catherine spoke up quietly. "Your Highness, there's something else you should consider. This person might not be working alone. If they have the resources to conduct surveillance on the palace, they likely have backing from someone with significant means." The three of them spent the next hour developing a plan. Davies would position security personnel around the Rose Garden Pavilion, disguised as groundskeepers and maintenance workers. Catherine would monitor communications from the palace while Isabella attended the meeting. They would wire Isabella with a small recording device to capture whatever demands or threats were made. The next evening arrived gray and drizzly, with autumn clouds casting long shadows across the palace grounds. Isabella made her way to the Rose Garden Pavilion, a small ornate structure that had been a favorite retreat of Queen Eleanor's. The irony of meeting there to discuss Eleanor's secret was not lost on her. She arrived exactly at 7 o'clock to find a figure already waiting in the shadows of the pavilion. As she approached, the person stepped into the dim light, and Isabella was surprised to see it was Victor Ashworth, the journalist she had noticed at the charity gala. "Your Highness, thank you for coming," Ashworth said with a polite nod that somehow managed to seem mocking. "Mr. Ashworth, I should have known. What exactly do you want?" Ashworth smiled coldly and gestured for her to sit on one of the stone benches within the pavilion. "I want the truth, Your Highness, and I want to help you manage that truth in a way that protects everyone's interests." "I don't know what you're talking about," Isabella replied, though she made no move to sit down. "Please, Your Highness, let's not waste time with denials. I know about the DNA tests, about Captain James Morrison, about Queen Eleanor's decades-long deception. I have photographs, recordings, and testimony from multiple sources. The question is not whether I can prove the story. The question is what we do about it." Isabella felt her composure cracking. "What do you want?" "Money." Ashworth laughed. "Money would be the easy solution, wouldn't it?" "No, Your Highness, I want something much more valuable. I want access. Exclusive access to the royal family, to document the transition from the old reign to the new. I want to be the journalist who tells the real story of the modern monarchy. And in exchange? In exchange, I help you control the narrative. We reveal Prince Alexander's parentage on our terms, in a way that emphasizes his worthiness to rule despite his illegitimate birth. We frame it as a story of love triumphing over bloodlines, of a queen who chose the best man for the throne regardless of biology." Isabella stared at him in shock. "You want to publish the story? The story is going to come out eventually, Your Highness. Too many people know or suspect the truth for it to remain hidden much longer. The question is whether it comes out as a carefully managed revelation that strengthens the monarchy or as a scandal that destroys it. And if I refuse your offer?" Ashworth's expression hardened. Then, the story breaks next week in the National Tribune, along with details about the palace cover-up, the secret surveillance, and the conspiracy to deceive the people of Valdoria. Prince Alexander returns from his diplomatic tour to find his kingdom in chaos and his legitimacy in question. Isabella realized she was trapped. Ashworth held all the cards, and her only choice was between two different versions of the same devastating outcome. "I need time to consider this," she said finally. "Of course, you have 48 hours to decide. But, Your Highness, consider this. Prince Alexander is going to learn the truth one way or another. Wouldn't it be better if it came from his wife rather than from a newspaper headline?" As Ashworth melted back into the shadows, Isabella remained in the pavilion, her mind racing with the implications of what had just occurred. The journalist was right about one thing. Alexander deserved to hear the truth from her before it became public knowledge. But how could she destroy the man she loved in order to save him? The recording device hidden in her jacket had captured every word of the conversation, but Isabella doubted it would be useful in any legal proceeding. Ashworth was too sophisticated to have made explicit threats or admitted to blackmail. He had simply presented her with a choice between two forms of devastation. As she walked back to the palace through the drizzling rain, Isabella realized that her 2 weeks of agonizing over whether to reveal Eleanor's secret had become irrelevant. The decision was being made for her, and all that remained was to choose how the truth would be told. The lights of the palace beckoned through the darkness, but they no longer represented the sanctuary they once had. Tomorrow, she would have to begin the process of preparing Alexander for the shock of his life, and preparing the kingdom for a constitutional crisis that would test the very foundations of the monarchy. The secret that Queen Eleanor had carried to her grave was about to be resurrected, and Princess Isabella had become not its guardian, but its executioner. The crown that had seemed so heavy with responsibility now felt fragile as glass, and she feared that revealing the truth about Alexander's parentage would shatter it completely. In her private study that night, surrounded by portraits of kings and queens whose bloodlines had defined the monarchy for centuries, Isabella began drafting the most difficult letter she had ever written. It was addressed to Alexander, and it would either save their marriage or destroy it. But first, she had to find the words to explain how love could coexist with deception, and how the truth could be both a blessing and a curse. The next 48 hours would determine whether the kingdom of Valdoria emerged stronger from its trial by fire, or whether it would join the ranks of fallen monarchies that had been toppled by their own secrets. And at the center of it all stood a princess who had never wanted anything more than to be worthy of the crown she was destined to wear. The 48 hours that followed Isabella's meeting with Victor Ashworth were among the longest of her life. She spent the time in a strange state of suspended animation, carrying out her royal duties while her mind churned through impossible scenarios and devastating consequences. The letter she had begun writing to Alexander remained unfinished on her desk, each attempt to find the right words ending in frustration and tears. On the morning that marked the end of Ashworth's deadline, Isabella received an encrypted message from Alexander that made her situation even more complicated. His diplomatic mission had been cut short due to a trade dispute that required immediate royal intervention, and he would be returning to Valdoria that very evening, a full week earlier than planned. The news sent Isabella into a panic. She had been counting on having more time to prepare for their conversation, more time to find the right way to shatter her husband's understanding of his own identity. Now she had mere hours to decide not just whether to tell him the truth, but how to do it in a way that wouldn't destroy him completely. Catherine Whitmore found Isabella in the palace chapel that afternoon, kneeling before the altar where royal marriages and coronations had taken place for centuries. The older woman approached quietly, her footsteps echoing softly on the ancient stone floors. "Your Highness," Catherine said gently, "Prince Alexander's plane has landed. He'll be here within the hour." Isabella didn't turn around. "I don't know how to do this, Catherine. How do you tell someone that their entire life has been built on a lie?" Catherine moved to sit in the pew behind Isabella, her voice thoughtful and compassionate. "Perhaps you start by reminding him of what hasn't changed, your love for him, his children's love, the respect and admiration of his people. The truth about his parentage doesn't diminish any of that, but it changes everything else. His claim to the throne, his children's inheritance, the stability of the monarchy itself. How can I be responsible for destroying all of that? Your Highness, you didn't create this situation. Queen Eleanor made her choices 40 years ago, and now the consequences have caught up with all of us. You can only control how you respond to the truth, not the truth itself. Isabella finally turned to face Catherine, her eyes red with unshed tears. What if he can't forgive me for keeping this from him, even for just these few days? What if discovering the truth destroys not just his identity as prince, but our marriage as well? Then, you'll face that outcome together, because Prince Alexander loves you as much as you love him. But, Your Highness, consider this. If Mr. Ashworth publishes his story without giving the prince a chance to respond, the damage will be far worse than anything that results from an honest conversation between husband and wife. The wisdom in Catherine's words was undeniable, but it didn't make the prospect of the coming confrontation any less terrifying. Isabella had faced many challenges during her 15 years as a member of the royal family, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The sound of vehicles approaching the palace announced Alexander's arrival. Isabella hurried to her chambers to compose herself, knowing that she needed to appear normal when she greeted her husband. The children would want to see their father immediately, and she couldn't arouse suspicions with unusual behavior. Prince Marcus, now 12, and Princess Sophia, 10, were waiting in the main hall with barely contained excitement when Alexander walked through the doors. Isabella watched from the top of the grand staircase as her husband embraced his children, his face lighting up with genuine joy at being reunited with them. The scene was achingly beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time, knowing as she did that their family was about to be tested in ways none of them could imagine. Alexander looked up and caught sight of Isabella on the staircase. His smile widened as he bounded up the steps to sweep her into his arms, spinning her around as he had done on countless homecomings throughout their marriage. "I've missed you terribly," he murmured against her ear, his familiar scent and warmth flooding her senses with both comfort and guilt. "Welcome home," she replied, hoping her voice sounded steady. "How were the negotiations?" "Successful, thankfully. We managed to resolve the trade dispute without compromising our agricultural exports. But enough about work. I want to hear everything that's been happening here." The children look like they've grown inches in the weeks I've been gone. They spent the evening as a family, dining together and listening to Marcus and Sophia recount their adventures during their father's absence. Alexander was relaxed and happy, clearly relieved to be home, and blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to break over their heads. After the children had gone to bed, Isabella knew she could delay the inevitable no longer. She had decided to tell Alexander everything before Ashworth's deadline expired at midnight. Whatever consequences followed, at least her husband would hear the truth from her rather than reading it in a newspaper. "Alexander," she said as they settled into their private sitting room, "there's something we need to discuss. Something important." The seriousness in her tone immediately caught his attention. "What is it, darling? You've seemed tense all evening. Is there a problem with the coronation preparations?" Isabella had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now that it was here, the words seemed to stick in her throat. She reached for the manila envelope containing Eleanor's documents, her hands trembling as she placed it on the coffee table between them. "I found something in your mother's study," she began carefully. Something she had hidden, something she never intended for anyone else to see. Alexander looked at the envelope with curiosity rather than concern. "What kind of something?" Isabella took a deep breath. "Documents that reveal a secret she kept for 40 years. A secret about your birth, about your biological parentage." The change in Alexander's expression was immediate. The relaxed happiness of moments before was replaced by wariness and growing alarm. "Isabella, what are you talking about?" With shaking hands, Isabella opened the envelope and withdrew the DNA test results, placing them where Alexander could see them. She watched his face as he read the damning conclusion, saw the exact moment when understanding dawned, and his world began to crumble. "This can't be right," he said quietly, his voice hollow with shock. "There must be some mistake." "I'm afraid there isn't," Isabella replied gently. "Your mother commissioned this test because of rumors that had been circulating for years. She needed to know the truth, even though she never intended to act on it." Alexander stared at the documents as if he could change their contents through sheer force of will. "My father, King Frederick, isn't my biological father. No. According to the DNA results and the other documents Eleanor left behind, your biological father was Captain James Morrison of the Royal Guard." Isabella went on to explain everything she had learned from Catherine and Eleanor's confession, watching as each revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. She told him about the affair, about Eleanor's anguish over the years, about the careful deception that had sustained the monarchy for decades. When she finished, Alexander sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours. His face had gone pale, and his hands shook as he reached for a glass of whiskey from the side table. So everything I am, everything I've been prepared for my entire life, is based on a lie, he said finally. It's based on love, Isabella corrected firmly. Your mother loved you enough to protect you from this truth, and King Frederick loved you as his own son regardless of biology. The crown you're meant to inherit isn't just about bloodlines. It's about your character, your dedication to the people, your ability to lead. Alexander laughed bitterly. But that's not how constitutional monarchy works, is it? The crown passes through bloodlines, not merit. If I'm not Frederick's biological son, then I have no legal claim to the throne. Alexander, listen to me, Isabella said urgently, moving to sit beside him on the sofa. You are the same man you were an hour ago. You're the same father to our children, the same husband to me, the same future king that Valdoria needs. This doesn't change who you are. But it changes everything else, Alexander replied, his voice breaking. My legitimacy, the children's inheritance, the stability of the kingdom itself. How many people know about this? Isabella's heart sank as she realized she would have to deliver another crushing blow. That's the other thing we need to discuss. Someone has discovered the truth independently, and they're threatening to make it public. Alexander's head snapped up, his grief momentarily replaced by alarm. What do you mean? Isabella told him about Victor Ashworth, about the surveillance, and the ultimatum, about the choice between a controlled revelation and a scandalous expose. As she spoke, she watched her husband's face cycle through shock, anger, and, finally, a grim determination that reminded her why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. This journalist, Alexander said when she finished, he wants us to cooperate in our own destruction? He claims he wants to help control the narrative, to present the story in a way that emphasizes your worthiness to rule despite your illegitimate birth. And if we refuse? He publishes everything, including details about the palace cover-up and the surveillance operation. Alexander stood up abruptly and began pacing the room, his mind clearly racing through the implications and possibilities. Isabella recognized the expression on his face. It was the same look he wore when dealing with complex diplomatic crises or constitutional challenges. When does he want an answer? Alexander asked. Isabella checked her watch. In about 3 hours. Alexander stopped pacing and turned to face his wife. Isabella, I need you to understand something. Whatever we decide tonight, whatever happens in the coming days or weeks, none of this changes how I feel about you or our marriage. You didn't create this situation, and you certainly don't deserve to be caught up in it. We're in this together, Isabella replied firmly. Whatever comes next, we face it as a family. Alexander moved to the window and stared out at the palace grounds, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. You know what the most painful part of all this is? It's not learning that Frederick wasn't my biological father. He was still my father in every way that mattered. It's not even the threat to my claim to the throne. It's the realization that my mother lived with this secret for 40 years, carrying this burden alone, watching me prepare for a crown she knew I had no legal right to wear. Isabella joined him at the window, taking his hand in hers. She believed you deserved that crown regardless of your parentage. She believed you were the right man to lead Valdoria into the future. And what do you believe? Alexander asked, turning to meet her eyes. Isabella didn't hesitate. I believe she was right. I believe you were meant to be king, and I believe the people of Valdoria are lucky to have you, regardless of whose DNA you carry. Alexander squeezed her hand gratefully, then straightened his shoulders in a gesture Isabella recognized as his way of preparing for battle. Then, we need to decide how we're going to handle this crisis, he said with renewed resolve. Because like it or not, we're about to face the greatest challenge in the history of the modern Valdorian monarchy. As midnight approached, Isabella and Alexander sat together in their private study, surrounded by the weight of history and the uncertainty of the future. The decision they made in the next few hours would determine not just their own fate, but the destiny of the kingdom they had sworn to serve. The truth was about to set them free, but first it might destroy everything they held dear at 11:45 that night. With 15 minutes remaining before Victor Ashworth's deadline, Alexander made the decision that would reshape the Valdorian monarchy forever. We tell the truth, he announced, his voice steady with newfound resolve. All of it. But we tell it our way, on our terms. Isabella looked at her husband with a mixture of admiration and terror. Are you certain? Once we cross this line, there's no going back. There was never any going back from the moment my mother made her choice 40 years ago, Alexander replied. The only question now is whether we face this crisis with dignity and honesty, or let it destroy us through scandal and deception. They spent the remaining minutes before midnight crafting a response to Ashworth that was both defiant and strategic. Alexander would not cooperate in any expose that sensationalized his mother's private struggles or his own identity crisis. Instead, he would hold a press conference within 48 hours where he would address the nation directly, revealing the truth about his parentage while reaffirming his commitment to serving as king. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of careful preparation and mounting tension. Alexander worked with his constitutional advisors to understand the legal implications of his illegitimate birth, while Isabella coordinated with the palace communications team to craft a message that would minimize the damage to the monarchy's reputation. The children were told the truth in private, age-appropriate conversations that emphasized the unchanging nature of their family's love while preparing them for the public scrutiny that was to come. Prince Marcus, at 12, grasped the political implications more fully than his younger sister, but both children surprised their parents with their resilience and unwavering support. "You're still our father," Sophia said simply when Alexander finished explaining the situation. "That's all that matters to us." Meanwhile, Victor Ashworth had not remained idle. Frustrated by the royal family's refusal to cooperate with his story, he had begun publishing articles that hinted at explosive revelations about the monarchy's legitimacy. The hints were vague enough to avoid legal challenges, but specific enough to generate intense speculation among the public and media. Constitutional scholars and political commentators began appearing on television programs to debate the theoretical implications of an illegitimate heir ascending to the throne. The discussions remained academic since no specific allegations had been made public, but the mounting speculation created an atmosphere of crisis that demanded resolution. On the appointed morning, Alexander dressed in the formal military uniform he wore for state occasions, his medals and decorations catching the light as Isabella helped him adjust his ceremonial sash. They had agreed that she would not appear at the press conference itself, but would instead remain at the palace with the children, ready to present a united family front in the aftermath of his announcement. "Are you ready for this?" Isabella asked as they shared a final quiet moment in their private chambers. "No," Alexander admitted with a rueful smile. "But I don't think anyone could be ready for something like this. I just hope that when the dust settles, Valdoria will still want me as their king." The press conference was held in the palace's formal throne room, with representatives from every major news organization in attendance. Alexander had insisted on taking questions, despite the advice of his communications team, believing that transparency required him to face whatever challenges the media might present. As he stood before the assembled crowd of journalists and cameras, Alexander appeared every inch the future king, poised, dignified, and unafraid. The ornate throne behind him served as a powerful reminder of the institution he was fighting to preserve, even as he prepared to shake its very foundations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "I have called this press conference to address recent speculation about the royal family and to share information that, while deeply personal, has implications for the constitutional future of our kingdom." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle over the room before continuing. 3 weeks ago, following the death of Queen Eleanor, documents were discovered among her private papers that revealed a secret she had carried for 40 years. These documents included DNA test results that proved, beyond any doubt, that I am not the biological son of the late King Frederick. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Cameras flashed, reporters began shouting questions, and the carefully maintained order of the press conference threatened to dissolve into chaos. Alexander waited calmly for the initial shock to subside before raising his hand for silence. "My mother had a brief relationship during a difficult period in her marriage, a relationship that resulted in my conception," he continued, his voice never wavering despite the personal nature of what he was revealing. "She made the decision to allow me to be raised as the legitimate heir, believing that the stability of the kingdom and my own well-being required this deception." Alexander went on to explain the circumstances of Eleanor's affair, his discovery of the truth, and his decision to make it public rather than allow it to emerge through scandal or speculation. He spoke with compassion about his mother's difficult choice and with respect for King Frederick, who had loved him as a true son despite having no biological obligation to do so. The question that now faces our nation, Alexander said as he neared the conclusion of his prepared remarks, is not whether I have the right bloodline to be king, but whether I have the character, dedication, and vision necessary to lead Valdoria into the future. That is a judgment I leave to the people and their elected representatives. The questions that followed were intense and often hostile. Reporters demanded to know why the deception had been maintained for so long, whether other members of the royal family had known the truth, and what Alexander intended to do if Parliament declared his claim to the throne illegitimate. To each question, Alexander responded with honesty and dignity, never attempting to deflect blame or minimize the seriousness of the situation. When asked whether he believed he should still become king despite his illegitimate birth, his answer was both humble and confident. I believe that leadership is earned through service, not inherited through bloodlines, he said. I have spent my entire adult life preparing to serve the people of Valdoria, and I believe I can continue to do so effectively as their king. But if the people and their representatives decide otherwise, I will respect that decision and support whatever course of action they believe is in the best interests of the kingdom. The press conference lasted nearly 2 hours, with Alexander facing every question without flinching or showing signs of the emotional turmoil he must have been experiencing. When it was finally over, he had succeeded in controlling the narrative around his revelation, presenting himself as a man of integrity who valued truth over personal ambition. The reaction to Alexander's announcement was swift and divided. Constitutional experts debated whether illegitimate birth disqualified him from the throne, with some arguing that centuries of precedent supported his exclusion, while others contended that modern democratic principles should favor his continued succession based on his qualifications rather than his bloodline. Public opinion polling conducted in the days following the press conference showed the nation split almost evenly, with slight majority supporting Alexander's continued claim to the throne. The deciding factor would ultimately rest with Parliament, which would need to pass legislation either confirming his legitimacy or establishing a new line of succession. Isabella found herself thrust into an unexpected role during this period, serving as the public face of the royal family while Alexander dealt with the constitutional crisis. She gave interviews to sympathetic journalists, attended charity events to demonstrate normalcy, and worked tirelessly behind the scenes to build support among influential political figures. The children adapted to their new reality with remarkable resilience, though they required constant protection from aggressive reporters and photographers seeking to capture their reactions to their father's revelation. Palace security was increased dramatically, and the family's public appearances were carefully managed to minimize opportunities for hostile questioning. 2 weeks after Alexander's press conference, Prime Minister Harrison requested a private meeting at the palace. Isabella and Alexander received him in the same study where Isabella had first discovered Eleanor's secret, the irony of the location not lost on any of them. "Your Majesty," Harrison began, using Alexander's title despite the uncertainty surrounding his legal claim to it. "I've spent considerable time consulting with constitutional scholars, parliamentary leaders, and legal experts about this unprecedented situation." Alexander and Isabella waited tensely for his conclusion, knowing that the Prime Minister's recommendation would likely determine Parliament's ultimate decision. "The consensus," Harrison continued, "is that while your biological parentage creates certain legal complications, your 40 years of preparation for the throne, your demonstrated competence in royal duties, and your transparent handling of this crisis have convinced a majority of parliamentary leaders that you should continue as our future king." Isabella felt relief flood through her, but Harrison held up a hand indicating he wasn't finished. "However, this support comes with conditions. Parliament will pass legislation formally legitimizing your claim, but it will also establish new protocols for royal succession that prioritize merit and democratic approval alongside traditional bloodline considerations. The monarchy will emerge from this crisis more accountable and more closely tied to the will of the people." Alexander nodded gravely. "I accept those conditions completely. The monarchy should serve the people, not the other way around." "There's one more thing," Harrison added. "We'll need to address the question of your biological father's family. Captain Morrison had children of his own, and they now have a claim to royal recognition, if not royal titles." This final revelation opened another chapter in the complex saga of Alexander's identity. The Morrison family, contacted discreetly by palace representatives, proved to be working-class Canadians who were as shocked by the revelation as anyone. They had no interest in royal titles or wealth, but they were eager to establish a relationship with their half-brother and his family. The constitutional legislation legitimizing Alexander's claim passed Parliament by a comfortable margin 6 weeks after his press conference. The vote was seen as a referendum on the monarchy's future, and its success indicated that the institution had survived its greatest crisis in centuries. Victor Ashworth, meanwhile, found his exclusive story undermined by Alexander's proactive disclosure. His subsequent articles about the royal scandal were largely ignored by a public that had already heard the truth directly from the source. His attempt to profit from the monarchy's crisis had backfired completely. On a bright spring morning 3 months after discovering Eleanor's secret, Isabella stood beside Alexander as he was formally crowned King of Valdoria in a ceremony that blended ancient tradition with modern democratic principles. Representatives of Parliament and the people were given unprecedented roles in the coronation, symbolizing the monarchy's new accountability to those it served. As the archbishop placed the crown on Alexander's head, Isabella reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The truth that had threatened to destroy their family had ultimately strengthened both their marriage and the institution they served. Queen Eleanor's secret had been revealed not as a scandal but as a testament to the power of love over bloodlines, character over birth, and honesty over deception. The new King Alexander I ruled with wisdom and humility, never forgetting that his crown had been earned rather than inherited. The Morrison family became beloved extended relatives, adding warmth and authenticity to the royal family's public image. And Princess Isabella, now Queen Isabella, served as a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage involve revealing truths that others would prefer to keep hidden. Years later, when historians wrote about this period in Valdorian history, they would mark it as the moment when the monarchy truly became modern, not because it abandoned tradition, but because it proved that traditions built on truth and merit could survive any crisis. The crown's hidden truth had become its greatest strength, and the royal family had emerged from their trial by fire more worthy of the people's trust than ever before. In the end, Queen Eleanor's secret had not destroyed the monarchy she had spent her life protecting. Instead, it had transformed it into something better, a crown earned through service rather than inherited through bloodlines, and a royal family bound together not just by titles and traditions, but by love, honesty, and an unshakable commitment to the truth.